Seller beware. Here's something that can put a seller in a very vulnerable position and also put them in a position where they are losing multiple thousands of dollars on the sale of their home. There are certain characteristics that make a buyer a shiny nickel, okay? One thing in particular is if they come in and offer way over asking. Right now, I've had multiple properties sell for 6 figures over ask. In fact, I set the record in Dutchess and Ulster counties for the highest percentage over ask with my sales. You can get over ask offers that actually see it through, but that's one characteristic, okay, is they take a flight off of ask. They will give the seller everything they're looking for in terms, all right? So that basically they're making themselves look like the absolute perfect buyer. You can get the perfect buyer and have the best terms, best priced in the least amount of time. That's the goal for your clients, but you have to vet those buyers very carefully to make sure that they are in fact what they say they are and not a buyer that is going to have you accept their offer and then you do the inspection and they're negotiating hard off the inspection, or they're dragging, signing contracts, and all of a sudden deals terms are changing once it gets to the attorneys. And as time's going by, now you're losing other buyers potentially that you had that were really solid, which puts you in a vulnerable position and makes you more apt to go along with changes. And there are different ways that that can come out. One of my more recent deals, the buyer offered significantly over asking, and it was like right out of the gate as soon as the listing went on the market, and terms that were, basically will close at the convenience of the seller. All the other terms were, just informational purposes only for the inspection, all this other stuff. This was a financed buyer who had a pre-approval saying 80% financed, 20% down. Meanwhile, he put in an offer that was 85% financed, 15% down, which made him that much more dependent on the appraisal. And if you've gone way over ask and you're not willing to address any potential appraisal gap, now you're only putting down 15% on top of it, which makes you that much more dependent on the appraisal, and you're not willing to address an appraisal gap. What happens if the house doesn't appraise in that situation is either the seller comes down to meet the appraised price, the buyer goes up to meet the appraised price, or the buyer and seller negotiate, come into the middle, whatever, to come up to terms, or the buyers can walk away with their deposit. Now, I asked the buyer, let's address any potential appraisal gap. If you're going to offer this much and only put down 15% and be this dependent on the lender, then let's take a look at this appraisal, and if you would address, how would you address any appraisal gap? Let's discuss this up front. Let's not wait 3 weeks from now when the appraisal comes in, and if it is low, address it then. Then now we're in the middle of August or July. Okay, I didn't want that. That would have put my client in a position of losing the tail end of spring market to now put her house back on the market in the middle of summer, which is one of the slower times in our area. Well, now that buyer, when confronted with this, said, yeah, I'm not going to address the appraisal gap in any way. It's not always the highest offer that gets accepted, and it's also not always the cash buyer that gets accepted. Let's say you have an offer that did not take that level of flight over ask, but their financing is solid and they're either willing to address an appraisal gap, or their financing is really showing them to not be stretching themselves with the lender, where they're not as dependent on the appraisal. You have to look at that and discuss with your client which buyer actually has the highest propensity to make it to the closing table. Then the terms. Right? At first, he made himself totally available as soon as possible. Seller's convenience for the closing. That worked really well for my seller. My seller already bought her next home. So for her, that worked really well, that he was willing to kind of coordinate so that it could be an easier transition on her. Well, now all of a sudden, he's saying, well, no, a closing of on or about a date in August is actually too soon. And this was a June negotiation. I mean, on or about a date in August was really something that you could have assumed would have been the norm. All of a sudden, he's talking about September, which would have messed up my seller also. If you don't really get into it and vet these buyers at the front end, before you go forward with inspections, before you go forward with taking time with getting into contracts and negotiations of contracts, and also the amount of time that it can take to get an appraisal back and all these other pieces, that if the deal falls apart at any point between now and then, and the reason why it falls apart has to do with something that is covered by a contingency. That buyer can walk away and that seller is now going back on the market. So you really want to make sure you're doing the best you can to vet that buyer as much as humanly possible for your seller. Thankfully, this one showed himself right out of the gate and we moved on. The other deal that I had, we went back and forth and it was the same thing. Went over ask by a significant amount, was giving everything to the seller, everything is good. We go back and forth. Now the problem with this was he was a VA mortgage, which even though he was actually addressing the appraisal gap, a VA mortgage has what's called an escape clause. The FHA mortgage has that too. And basically that trumps what's in a contract. So, and the appraisal gap is something that's addressed in that escape clause. And if the buyer has addressed an appraisal gap at the front end and said, you know, I will cash fund an appraisal gap, that buyer could more than likely still get out of the deal because of that escape clause. Another difference with the FHA and VA mortgages is that the appraiser, when the appraiser comes out on a conventional mortgage, they're basically just coming out to appraise the house. When an appraiser comes out for an FHA or a VA mortgage, they're also looking at different issues that might need to be repaired at the house, and they could insist on certain things being repaired prior to closing in order to get that loan. This particular property had repairs that needed to go on, so that was really not something that would have been of interest to my client. It's definitely really important when you're working with a realtor that they know these different nuances so that they can properly guide you. We worked through terms during the course of the day, back and forth, to get to the point where I felt more comfortable presenting the offer to my client and covering some of these other bases and places of exposure for him. We get through it. We're about to hang up the phone, and I'm getting ready to call my client, and the buyer's agent says, oh, by the way, we need to go tomorrow to see the property. And I was like, what are you talking about? You haven't been to the property? Now, there are buyers that buy fully virtual, and the buyer's agent goes to the property, does a FaceTime. I've sold houses that way. But the buyer's agent hadn't even been to the house. Neither one of them had been to the house. And I had multiple offers on this property. And I'm like, okay, so you're asking me to now go turn my back on solid buyers that have been to the property, taken time looking at the property, they know they want this property. You're asking us to now turn our backs to those buyers to wait for you to come. I said, you know what, come this afternoon. You're going to do it, come this afternoon. No, we can't come this afternoon. And so I talked with my seller about it, and he was pretty infuriated by the whole thing and told me to take a pass to those buyers, which we did. If it does seem like it's too good to be true, definitely take the extra steps to make sure that you've covered bases in really looking at the buyer. Really get into what they're going to commit to actually in contract before you even move forward.